Alright, so today we're going to be talking about nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. Just like the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle is, a circular recycling and refiltering of nitrogen from one form to another. Some forms are useful to plant and animal life and some forms are not. And this is just another one of the ways that God has created a world with everything it needs to sustain life. Because, if one of these steps weren't around, then, life wouldn't exist as we know it. Either there wouldn't be enough nitrogen in plants and animals to grow and reproduce properly, or there would not be enough nitrogen in soil or the air to then replenish that system with the plants and animals. So if one of these steps were missing, then again, life as we know it wouldn't exist. So this again just shows how God has everything in mind and everything planned out and everything accounted for. So let's start by talking a little bit about nitrogen itself. This lovely picture here is sort of basically an atom of nitrogen. So nitrogen is the seventh element on the periodic table. That means it's got 7 protons in the center. Those are the red things, and they have basically a positive charge. And then there are 7 neutrons, the black things, and then there are also 7 electrons, which are the blue things in those circles, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But basically, if you remember from when we talked about the atmosphere, basically 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So we have a lot of it, which is very good because it is necessary for plants and animals to make up their structure. It's very useful in amino acids and nucleic acids, including DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. So all of those bits and pieces that hold all the codes that make, everything that's alive is made out of nitrogen, or at least nitrogen is a part of it. So, talking about going back to the atomic level, we have this atom of nitrogen. Now, the way atoms like to work is that these little green circles that we have here, this is a simplistic model, but for us it serves our purpose and it works. It's still a widely used model, even if it's not the most technically correct, but it's still a very, very commonly used model for pretty much everyone who isn't talking about nuclear physics and how the electrons and protons move around. Pretty much everyone else uses these models. So these are called their orbital shells, and basically these electrons, there are these 7 different electrons, and they can move anywhere amongst these shells. I have them shown at 2 different levels, and there are 2 different levels, and at any point, really, theoretically, any of these 7 electrons could be at any point in these 2 orbitals or shells. But the way, that these shells are, said to be happy or filled is if there are 2 electrons in this inner shell, and then we get to this outer shell, and we want to have 8 electrons. You can see we're missing these electrons. Now, just for the sake of ease, it's often shown that the electrons other than this inner shell are shown in these groups of 2, and you can see these bottom 3 are missing their pairs. Now that creates, for when nitrogen combines with other nitrogen atoms, these 3 electrons get shared between both nitrogen atoms, creating a very, very strong bond in what's called then a diatomic nitrogen atom. We also have diatomic oxygen. When an atom or a molecule, or when a molecule is said to be diatomic, that just means there are two atoms of the element that are combined to make the molecule. So in our case, we're talking about two nitrogen atoms, or, also in the atmosphere there are two oxygen atoms that combine and again share electrons to get those 8 electrons in that second orbital to make everything happy. Now, the problem with that is our bodies cannot use diatomic nitrogen in our amino acids or nucleic acids, so that's where the nitrogen cycle comes in. For nitrogen has to go through various processes to be able to be used in our bodies. Before we get all the way to the nitrogen cycle, we're going to talk a little bit about just some terms that'll come up. Okay? And these terms kind of are going from the smallest to the largest. They all interrelate, and it's all about relationships. Okay, so first we have our subatomic particles. These are the particles that are, below the atom. They're inside the atom. They're smaller than the atom, so that would be like very obviously we've got the protons, neutrons, and electrons, but even inside those we have different parts. Protons can be broken apart, neutrons can be broken apart. You get things like quarks and bosons and all of those kinds of things, and those are our subatomic particles. Okay, and then when you look at one whole thing, we've got an atom. An atom is, it's funny because the definition of an atom is, it's the smallest unit of mass, I guess, but then they went and assigned mass to the subatomic particles, so I'm not exactly sure, but why it's the smallest unit of mass, but that's the definition that is common. Then we have a molecule. So like we talked about the diatomic nitrogen or the diatomic oxygen, or even something like H2O, which is water, or C6H12O6, which would then be sugar. When those atoms combine together to form things, that's when you get a molecule. And a molecule is the smallest group of those that are still that thing. So when you have just the 2 hydrogens and the 1 oxygen, it's still water. It's the smallest amount of water you can chemically have, but it's still water. Okay, and then when you get enough molecules together, you can have, a mountain, or you can then, if, where we start to go to the life science end of it, then you start to get cells. And cells are very complicated, basically little machines that do things. If you take life science, if you've taken life science, you talked more about the parts of cells and the things that they do and how they replicate and provide energy for themselves and things like that. But basically all those cells are just, made up of molecules. Okay, and then when you get all the cells working toward the same goal, that's a really bad arrow, working toward the same goal, that's a tissue. So in a human body, your tissues would be your muscle tissue or your bone tissue, your skin, things like that, and it's just a collection of cells that are all doing the same thing. A little bit bigger, then we get to our organs. So you have, your stomach, your liver, your spleen, your lungs. Again, the lungs are a really good example because we have more than one tissue doing something together. It has one cohesive purpose, but we have blood vessels, we have the actual lungs themselves where there's, the kind of the outer covering, and then inside you can break it up and you've got the bronchioles and the air sacs and all of that, but it's still a whole combined part of organs. And then, you've got the organ systems, and eventually, when you get enough organ systems together, then you get an organism. So you get a plant or an animal. Okay, and then when you have lots of organisms together, then we get into our community. You know, you have a community, or sometimes it's called a population, of a particular organism. You know, and that's just the group of them that are in a specific area. Now, when we have lots of communities together, say we have the community of humans and the community of cats and the community of dogs and the community of grass and the community of pine trees, then you have an ecosystem of, you know, wherever you are. It could be, you know, we could have the ocean ecosystem, which definitely has different communities than, say, a polar ecosystem, which is, again, going to have different communities from a tropical ecosystem. And so those are specific pockets of communities that have different organisms depending on different factors. A big factor is climate, and that determines what organisms can survive in certain areas. But that's generally how ecosystems are divided. And then we get into the biosphere, bio meaning life, and it's just all the life everywhere. So we've got our biosphere. All the ecosystems together make the biosphere. So we're starting with, again, with our smallest known particles, which are the subatomic particles. For right now, the protons, neutrons, electrons. Get enough of those together, you get an atom. Then that reaches up to molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, communities, ecosystems, and then the biosphere. And now all of these wouldn't be, you know, wouldn't be possible, wouldn't be what we know them to be if we couldn't, you know, harness or deal with nitrogen at the subatomic and atomic level. We want to get that diatomic nitrogen down to just a single nitrogen state. We want to break it from 2 nitrogen atoms together to just the 1 nitrogen atom. And there are lots of different processes involved. One of which is lightning. You know, that smell that you get after a lightning storm, that's a lot of nitrogen that has been ripped apart. The electrons have just been ripped apart from each other because of the heat and the pressure that's caused from the lightning bolt. In the lab, I believe they've now been able to well, I know they've been able to separate nitrogen, but it's at, you know, 300 atmospheres and 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, which are astronomically high, you know, units. You know, where we are now at the surface of the Earth, we're under 1 atmosphere of pressure. So to get the nitrogen to split apart, not only do we have to heat it, you know, exponentially more than what we're normally used to, than what many metals have to be heated to be able to melt them and cast new things. But then we also have to add 300 times more pressure than our current atmosphere is pushing down. So it is possible to do it, but it is very difficult, and you only get kind of mediocre results. Even if you have, you know, tons of lightning storms, it's not enough to completely replenish the nitrogen that has been taken out of the soil from plants, because, you know, in a lightning storm, that single molecule of oxygen, or that single atom of nitrogen is then going to go into the soil. Okay, so what we have over here is then now we're getting into the actual nitrogen cycle. In lieu of lightning storms happening every 2 days, God has created bacteria and plants that can break apart this nitrogen into useful forms so that it can be used by plants and then, you know, eventually eaten by animals as, you know, the nitrogen is absorbed by the plants, and then the animals that eat it absorb it and then can use it in their bodies. Okay, so we're going to start here with our nitrogen in the atmosphere, and we'll work our way around this diagram. Very similar to the diagram that's in your class materials. I think it's just like flipped on 180 degrees. I guess it'd be on the y-axis. Anyway, okay, so we have this nitrogen in the atmosphere. The nitrogen in the atmosphere somehow gets worked into the soil. It happens, soil gets dug up and the air gets mixed in, or, you know, worms aerate it. Anyway, so the nitrogen goes into the soil. So there are certain plants that just kind of have, they're very good hosts for this nitrogen fixing bacteria. Particularly legumes, peanuts, clover, alfalfa, those are all good. And they're also often called cover crops. The particular plants that are good for these are called cover crops. And they're very useful because, you know, they are good at breaking apart the nitrogen. They supply hosts for this nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and that breaks apart the nitrogen that is in the air, that's in the soil, and then the nitrogen is just kind of in the soil until other plants take it out. So often farmers will, you know, every now and then plant one of these cover crops just to kind of replenish the nitrogen that's in the soil. So from these particular cover crops, from these legumes, the nitrogen can be absorbed directly into the plants. So, you know, into the peanuts or whatever else. Often these plants aren't eaten by people, but I know horses like a lot of the other plants. Not so sure about peanuts, but horses definitely like the clover and the alfalfa. Okay, so if there aren't these cover crops, the nitrogen then just sits around in the soil until some of the bacteria finds it. Okay, the bacteria then basically digests the nitrogen and kicks out ammonia. Now, ammonia is still not exactly what we want, and so then there are some more bacteria that then process the ammonia into nitrates. And then sometimes it's absorbed directly into the plants. Sometimes it goes through another cycle and then nitrites are formed. But we'll talk about that again in a moment. Okay, so then it's absorbed into the plants. The animals eat the plants. So now we have this reserve of nitrogen in the plants or in the animals. So then you know, it's fall and the plants die and decompose, or eventually the animal reaches the end of its lifespan and it decomposes, and then we have the detritus and the detrivores, the decomposers, the mushrooms. They decompose, they digest the nitrogen that was in the plant or the animal, again going back to the ammonia. So we also have some, when we get to this nitrate cycle, we have some other bacteria that can put the nitrogen back into its diatomic state and put it back into the atmosphere. Okay, so let's go over that one more time, not looking at the soil. So here's one with fish. Okay, and we're going to start here with our fish and then go clockwise. I'm sorry. Okay, so happy fish eat, breathe, and poop, but fish respiration, waste, and decomposition create ammonia. Ammonia is poisonous to our finned friends. Ammonia is also poisonous to us. It's a good cleaner, but you definitely don't want to get it into your mouth. Okay, so here we've got this little ammonia guy, this ammonia molecule, and our fish says, what? But never fear, our good friend Nitrosomus, this guy, to the rescue. This bacteria eats ammonia, but he also generates nitrite as a byproduct. So here's our nitrite, which is also dangerous to the fish. Not to worry, since Nitrobacter is rarely far behind. He eats the nitrite and leaves nitrate in his wake. Nitrate is safe for our aquatic friends at moderate levels. or the same similar types of processing go through happen in the soil, and so we go from the nitrogen that's in the air to an ammonia to a nitrite to a nitrate, and then plants use nitrate to grow, and anaerobic oxygen hating bacteria feed on it. In the wild, fish feed on the plants, and the cycle continues. In our aquarium, we trim the plants and change water to remove nitrate. Okay, so that is their example that we're talking about. So we go through this cycle, creating, changing the diatomic nitrogen to a nitrate, which is then helpful and necessary for these plants. But as you can see, if we didn't have this guy, the Nitrosomonas, or the Nitrobacter, or whatever other bacterias there are. I'm not sure if they're exactly the same bacterias in the soil as in this this water version of the nitrogen cycle. If those bacteria weren't around, then we wouldn't have, our basically our cellular structure, because we wouldn't be able to make those amino acids or the nucleic acids. And that would then, plants have DNA just like animals do, and so there wouldn't be any plants, and there wouldn't be any animals then. So this is definitely a very important part of life on Earth. And again, if just one of these types of bacteria was gone, at one of these stages, either this one to change the ammonia to a nitrite, or this one to change the nitrite to a nitrate, then, we would definitely have a whole other system, even if there were life at all. So again, it just shows you that, God really knew what was going on, and knew what we would need, and knew what would need to be provided, so that this cycle could continue, and that all of his creations would have what they need, and all of his creations would be provided for, because God created the bacteria just the same as he created us, even though the process was a little bit different. So again, the thought that all of these organisms just happen to occur spontaneously to create what we have, it seems like, our whole universe was made in a giant dice game. And that is just very difficult to get behind those kinds of statistics. It seems much more likely that someone thought about this and planned it and thought about what needed to happen, and that our universe was engineered instead of having a universe that was, for lack of a better term, gambled upon.